What's the stupidest thing you've had a patient come in for? Had a patient come into the ER with very mild abdominal pain. I asked when it started and he said right now. He didn't have a coherent answer when I asked how he knew to come to the ER if his pain just started now. I still don't understand what brought him in. It was an all-around odd encounter and he left pretty quickly. We didn't do anything for him. On a side note, he complained about the wait. He waited 12 minutes after he checked in before I saw him. I checked the records, I'm not exaggerating. Literally 12 minutes. I got seen to within 5 minutes when I last went into the ER. Granted, I had fainted and hit my head against the pebble tile floor, splitting the skin down to the bone with blood pouring down my face, and I was battling to stay awake, cause it was still quite soon after when I fainted. A nurse took my vitals and got me into a bed, and brought my boyfriend in to keep an eye on me. It then took 2 to 3 hours before the doctor could get to us. The nurses checked on us a couple of times. By the time the doctor had a chance to get to us, she walked in tensely, shoulders high, and she started by apologizing profusely for the wait. We both had to reassure her with "We understand triage, I'm stable, no need to apologize," and I literally saw the tension go out of this woman as she realized we weren't going to verbally abuse her. We ended up having a nice chat and a laugh while she stitched up my forehead, making Harry Potter jokes. Turns out it was a busy night at the ER. She had a whole bunch of patients, and one guy had come in for some major abdominal issue, and then also had a heart attack. She also told us the story about how, at another hospital, she was trying to treat a woman with multiple gunshot wounds to the abdomen, gang crossfire, and some guy and his dad started berating her and screaming at her cause they were there first. He'd pulled a muscle at the gym. She told them that someone had been shot and they said "We don't care." I feel so much for ER doctors. They really have to deal with incredibly stressful situations, life and death, and then on top of that, verbal abuse, threats, and vitriol are just part of the job, and that's so horrible. I hope I made that doctor's evening just a tiny bit better. You never know who is having mental health problems though. I remember taking a friend to the emergency room because he started acting confused and dazed. I drove him right up to the door and told him to walk into the emergency room. I had to drive pretty far ways because regular visitors to the hospital like to park in the emergency room parking lot because it's the closest one to the hospital that isn't restricted to doctors. By the time I got to the emergency room, he'd already gone back. I figured it was obvious that something was wrong with him, so I didn't go back. A few minutes later he come walking out carrying a printout of how to treat heartburn. I made him go back and at first, the lady resisted letting the doctors see him again. They didn't figure it out that night, but eventually, he found out that a certain pill he'd been taking had confusion as a side effect. A guy I dated in college thought he was having a heart attack, which was odd because he was 22. I had no idea what to do since all his symptoms fit everything you hear about what happens when you have a heart attack. So we called his dad, in a different state. He says "WTF? Guys, call an ambulance." Ambulance gets there. I'm starting to really worry. He can hardly breathe, drenched in sweat, doubled over with chest pains, tears streaming down his face. The ambulance guy asks, "Did you just quit smoking?" He replies, "Ooh, yes. EMT, we'll have a smoke. You're having a panic attack from nicotine withdrawal." We all had a chuckle after he had a couple of puffs and returned to normal. EMS guys hung out for a few minutes to make sure he was fine. We both felt really stupid after that. Crazy how different substances can make your body go wacky. The fuck? The times that it's been so short for me have been when the emergency was literally empty, or that one time I had hives and a swollen throat. I brought my mother to the ER with chest pain and left arm numbness and they told her it was going to be a 30-minute wait. I mean, I still was treated in a hallway and not in a room or anything. Also, hives are very visible and obvious, and often can come with a swollen throat when there's an allergic reaction. Chest pain can be a lot of things and they can't see it. Which is why they need to find out very quickly because many of these things are fatal. Same. But she ended up dying in the waiting room. They were able to zap her back to life. Not a doc, so I have no idea what the thing is called. She went on to have 13 more heart attacks over the next decade before dying of a heart attack, in the same hospital. Defibrillator is what that thing is called, I believe. Also not a doctor. I loved watching our ER big board up in the IT office, normally when we'd have to do maintenance in a room on a PC or to gauge the load of the ER if we had to do something that could impact their operations. I always enjoyed the calm before the storm, so to speak. They always kept one bed open, always room 1 or room 2, the trauma bays, for the ambulances. You know it's a bad day when they're using hall beds or the beds on the disaster screen to hold patients, disaster being the temporary cots during a musical incident, but in reality, It's Sever Hall patients and or patients that can't be discharged from the ER system due to integrations failure that must be resolved before discharge electronically. My best memory was of the drunk college kid in the observation beds across from the ward clerk station. He was the only patient in the entire ER, sleeping like a baby. This was around 7:30 a.m. The kid was knocked out on vitamin IVs and they were ordering him breakfast from the cafeteria. They told me when it's quiet like this they're generally nicer on the drunks, but if it was busy his ass would be back out the door as soon as he was up. Does calling EMS so you can get a ride to the hospital to see your other homeless friend who is in there count? I am not kidding. This person said she had a syncope episode, then as soon as she got to the hospital, hopped off the stretcher and said she was fine after the doctor talked to her and went to another room. The ER I used to work in as a registrar used to have a homeless man regular that'd show up and get admitted for something like abdominal pain. I don't think they ever found anything actually wrong with him, then demand that we get him an ambulance to take him to the fancy hospital in the big city about an hour from us. He never had any really good reason other than he insisted they would be able to figure out what was wrong with him. If we didn't do it, which was always the case, he'd just sit in our lobby and glare and yell at me or whoever else was on front desk. So much fun. P can sympathize with you completely. I am a registrar, at work right now, but it's slow, and the death stare and yelling we get from people because they have to wait, is horrible. Sometimes I'll yell back at them and tell them to quit being a fucking asshole and look around and see how busy it is, and that there is literally no open beds right now. Not a human experience, but we had a pup that was about 7 months old admitted for essentially an evisceration. Now while the thought of a small puppy having a giant hole in its stomach and all of the organs spilling out is terrifying, it was completely preventable. After the spay, the owners were instructed to leave the cone of shame on the puppy at all times if she was not being directly supervised. Well, they didn't, claiming that it looked like it was hurting her, so they took it off and left the house. The puppy promptly licked open her stitches and from there, it got kind of gruesome. The even more stupid part is that the owners threatened to sue us because it was our fault that they ignored medical instructions and thusly had to come back in and pay over $1,000 to have their puppy's life saved. People are dumb. Edit, the puppy survived and I see her regularly at our clinic. The stitches were dissolvable but they don't instantly do so, hence the cone. We did follow procedure by stating the expenses beforehand to determine if the owners would have to surrender. Luckily they were financially stable enough to afford the immediate surgery. Had they surrendered, I'm confident that the puppy would have become mine. Thanks for the responses. This is a little off topic but I just found out about it and think it's a pretty good example of animal-related stupidity. The other night I had dinner with my mother and she told me that about a year ago her 2 Yorkie poos were arrested. They had gotten out of the house and a neighbor had called the police. The police, for some strange reason, thought that it would be a good idea to bring them to the station and literally put them in jail. Took a while for it to get back to my mom and on Friday night she called the cops and asked if they had the dogs. Yes, the officer who picked up the phone replied, and good thing you called when you did, because otherwise they'd have been locked up until Monday. Because, you know, human beings can't be arraigned on the weekend and the same applies for dogs. All I could imagine was officers bringing Bobo and Lola ham sandwiches and cartons of milk all weekend. I saw something similar once. I'd taken my own cat to the local emergency center after being hit by a car. While I'm waiting to find out some test results, this couple screeches in and rushes in as quickly as possible. I don't remember if they had a bundle or a carrier. Apparently, their cat had just had an operation and at home had slipped and fallen down some stairs, basically tearing itself apart. God, reminds me of when we had my dog spayed. She came home doped to all hell, and that night she wanted to be let out to pee. My mom lets her out, and just as I say make sure she doesn't, we hear this god-awful yelp. Our garden was on 3 tiers, and the dog liked to jump onto the second tier to pee. My mom had somehow thought that a drugged-up dog would be smart enough not to try that post-surgery, and it hadn't occurred to her that the dog needed supervision. We all run outside, it's pitch black, I find my way down onto the second tier, and the poor dog is just standing there, slightly hunkered down, shaking. I gently check her tummy to make sure her stitches hadn't split. They hadn't, thank God, and we end up bringing her bed down so she could lie in it and we could lift her back up and into the house, passing her from person to person to get her up over the wall, in the dark, and trying not to jostle her. Poor sweet dog. She was fine, but I'll never forget that scream. Ugh. This happened to my bunny. He got himself stuck behind my couch and ate a large hole in a blanket. He had to have stomach surgery to have a mass removed because he was going into GI stasis. Bunnies can't do a cone of shame because they have side-facing eyes and it would completely blind them. On our way home, he slipped a stitch and I didn't notice it until I went to clean a poop from his stomach. Got a paper towel, bent down, and realized it wasn't pooped, it was a 2-inch segment of his intestine. I screamed for my roommate to find an emergency vet ASAP, and he was nice enough to sit in the back seat with my bun while I rushed to the emergency vet. They didn't have an exotic vet at that office and he wouldn't survive transportation to another vet, but they called around so they could get more information. They cleaned his intestine, pushed it back in, and gave him a 50-50 chance of surviving. For 10 days I had to inject him with penicillin and oral pain meds, and I slept on the couch so I could be closer to him. I drove 25 minutes each way on my hour-long lunch just to make sure he was okay. I love my boy so much, and I was so incredibly devastated when that all happened. I felt like my world was falling apart. A year later, my Bubba is still his bouncy happy self, and you would never realize what kind of trauma we went through. My brother and his ex bought a puppy and she named it Turkey. Really sweet dog, although a bit too excitable. Anyways, the dog grew up and she didn't want it because it wasn't a puppy anymore. My brother came home from work to find Turkey outside the house wandering around. She thought it was a good idea if she just let it free since she didn't want it anymore. Some people shouldn't own pets or have kids. So I guess for girl cats it's a lot more intense, so the vet gave my baby girl a soft cone. Boy cats usually don't need one, until my baby boy. Turns out he started biting the stitches and they were bruised and bleeding everywhere. The vet said in 26 years he'd never seen a male cat do that. So they both got cones, lol. That's my special boy. I had a friend whose dog literally started eating its own tail. He got a cone and was supposed to leave it on. Anyway, there was an exchange student staying there at the time and she thought it looked like the dog was in pain and took off the cone. The tail had to be amputated to the tune of $2,000. A few years ago my dog had some cancer and got it removed. It was a decent sized area. I think she lost 2 ribs in the process. The void left over kept filling with fluid. I remember it was Halloween but don't remember exactly what I was doing, but I heard fluid pouring onto the dining room floor. Now my dog was on a lot of meds at the time, including sedatives and painkillers. So I thought, "Oh Sparks, you gotta tell me when you gotta go outside," so I look over and she's not squatting but standing up looking at me kind of confused. At this point I notice the fluid, very red at first, is trickling out of her side. I go into panic mode, take her outside to minimize fluid damage in the house, and take off my shirt to hold against the leak. My mom happened to be sleeping upstairs after working some weird shift. I scream for her till she comes out. I throw a tarp in the back of my car and tell my mom to get in and keep something on her wound and drive up to the vet. We get there and apparently this isn't a big deal. Too much fluid built up, stitch popped, fluid drained. They needed to get her on some Diurex, SP, water pills, and fix the stitch and she should be fine. So the vet was more concerned with me having an anxiety attack at the desk than the mild repair my dog needed. My old coworker's dog had that happen. Post-spay, wouldn't stay calm like she was supposed to. Jumped off the couch and opened up her incision, intestines coming out. She was rushed to the vet for surgery and lived a long life, but they always joked that their free dog was a rescue/rehome, was the most expensive dog they've owned. Honestly, if you don't want to do the cone and a soft baby onesie will work. My parents did the after our dog had a few surgeries since she was too dumb to survive with a collar. You just cut a tail hole and then roll it out of the way when you take them outside. Something like this happened back when I had guinea pigs. I got a female off Craigslist a my mom got another female from the Humane Society a little while later so she'd have a friend. Well, some time goes by and they're growing up and I noticed my guinea pig was getting fat. But I just figured she was hogging the food because she didn't get huge. Then one day they were being really loud so I went to the room they were in to feed them a see what was up and saw tiny extra guinea pigs in there. Turns out my mom's guinea pig was a boy. So we called the Humane Society and they said if we brought him in, they'd fix him for free. So I took him in and picked him up the same day, and when I went to check on him, of course right after the Humane Society had closed for the day, I noticed he had something hanging out between his legs where the stitches were. I freaked out and we took him to the emergency vet and got him fixed up and he was fine, except no one at the Humane Society or the emergency vet thought to tell us we had to keep him separated from my guinea pig for a while until he was sterile. By the end of everything, we had 10 guinea pigs. We found homes for all of them because I didn't feel like I was a good rodent owner lol, but damn, our baby guinea pig's adorable. And we got really good at figuring out their gender by the end. My husband took the cone off the dog after she was spayed because she didn't like it. Of course she chewed out the stitches. Thankfully she didn't get beyond the first layer, it was still scary and gross. He got to call the vet and make the 30-mile drive to bring her in the following morning. I feel horrible after reading some of the replies to this, so I'm adding this vaguely relevant story as a cheerful alternative. My cat got spayed at 6 months old, and she also had to wear the cone of shame. I was told to keep it on the entire time, so I did. So I went to bed one night and everything is normal. I wake up the next morning, and she wants attention like normal. I'm half asleep, so I just start petting her head, and then petting her neck, going down her back. Until, suddenly, something is blocking my hand. I open my eyes, and found out that my cat had somehow gotten the cone loose enough to push her front paws through, but not loose enough for the whole thing to just come off. I honestly don't know how she did it. I just woke up to my cat wearing the upside-down tutu of shame around her waist. Typically the clinic will keep the animal until they're healthy enough to be fostered and then placed with a forever family, or they will just keep them until they're adopted in general. A lot of the time they end up fostered by someone within the clinic. Most of the time when the clinic workers foster an animal they just stay with them forever. We, lovingly, refer to them as foster failures. Whilst working as a GP, primary care physician, I had a 40-ish-year-old man come in with his wife complaining of electric shocks for the past year. It quickly became apparent these were static shocks caused by his cheap work suit and rubber-soled work shoes. I explained he just needed to change his shoes, and it would stop, but both him and his wife were baffled. They'd never heard of static shocks and couldn't understand why I couldn't treat his condition. Unfortunately, I have no power to change the laws of physics. When my kids were little, my daughter kept coming into my room and telling me that lightning was striking her in bed and it hurt. For the most part I just thought she was trying to sleep in my bed and dismissed it. This happened over several nights and I pointed out that it wasn't even raining. Finally, my son started complaining about the same thing, so I went to lay down in bed with my daughter and all of a sudden these sparks began to fly and we got quite the shock. It actually hurt. Turns out I bought them each a new comforter, one blue and one pink, and it was some kind of fuzzy polyesterish material that when you moved it against itself created a significant spark. All you had to do was move the comforter and if it rubbed up against itself, huge shocking spark. I work in a burn unit. Had another hospital fly, yes fly as in $50,000 helicopter ride a patient over. Patients ended up having what looked like a bad tan on a small portion of their body. There were a couple of little blisters on their leg, and they wouldn't stop screaming for pain medication and claiming that they were in 12/10 pain. Fairly sure that sending ER was just trying to dump them on us. Edit, everyone can stop telling me how super serious and special their sunburns were. You still don't need a helicopter. Fairly sure that sending ER was just trying to dump them on us. $50,000 helicopter ride, that's a very expensive way to get rid of somebody. Well, that's the patient's problem. Seriously. I went to urgent care a few weeks ago because I'd injured my back the night before. I was in a moderate amount of pain, but mostly concerned with it turning into something serious. The nurse dude did the standard intake and when he got to the pain question was very surprised when I didn't say it was a 10. Like dude, I've torn my ACL and I have endometriosis. I've hurt worse than this for days at a time. I just think you should save 10 cents for when you're in the middle of getting your face eaten by a polar bear while a monkey plays with your intestines. Not a doctor but worked in an ER for several years. There was certainly a bit of cynicism that is probably prevalent in many similar settings. We'd get people bringing their kids in for hangnail or split ends on their hair. No, seriously, the inverse, however, was that sometimes you could not be too cynical as it could have been a big deal in the end. I remember one time a Haitian family came in and most of the staff would roll their eyes when Haitians came in because their English was typically terrible and they would not be able to convey what was wrong. In most cases it was something like baby has sniffles or constipation, not really emergencies. This particular family brought a teen who claimed his eye hurt. Between the language barrier and the complaint, most people just shrugged and said, yeah, okay whatever. Turns out the kid got a CT scan that showed worms basically eating his brain. I don't remember the outcome but the doctors guessed it was poorly cooked pork. To be honest, not sure if the kid even lived or not. I was on the other end of this once, although thankfully it was nowhere as serious. My daughter had a rash appear on her legs very suddenly one afternoon. Because it was Saturday I took her straight to the ER, where a nurse glanced at her ankle, said everything was fine, yelled at me for not giving my daughter paracetamol, then sent me to the out-of-hours GP clinic, albeit begrudgingly and only because it's hospital policy. The doctor there checked my daughter properly and was absolutely astounded. It turned out it was a really rare type of rash that he'd never seen IRL before. And he confirmed that I'd done the right thing by not giving my daughter paracetamol. It's tough. I worked with great people for the most part, but I know sometimes some things would just be brushed off as nothing. I remember a sad one where a lady came in with her kid on vacation and acting very surprised, denial? That her kid was covered in bruises. He looked like a leopard, and that his gums were bleeding a lot when she brushed his teeth. She was saying things like, "He's been playing pretty rough lately, so maybe that's it." It was bad times.